Hey there. Tonight, we're wide awake in a 14th century monastery. Insomnia isn't just a curse here. It's practically a spiritual obligation. And the cures, they're worse than the condition. Drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. Brother Aldrich can't sleep. 4 nights straight now. It shows. His eyes look desperate, the kind that comes from staring at rafters all night, while rats tap dance in the walls. The straw beneath him has compressed into misery. Somewhere in stone corridors another monk practices prayer, or what he calls prayer. It sounds like strangling geese. This is 1347. Insomnia is trendy. Nobody calls it insomnia though. Learned men prefer dramatic terms, like wakeful melancholy, or the devil's vigilance. Much more theatrical than saying you can't sleep, because Jeffrey mutters about turnips and the roof leaks onto your feet. But whatever you call it, the problem remains the same. An entire civilization trying to rest on beds that would make camping equipment look luxurious. The monastery's infirmary has a manuscript. Remedium Somni, it's called, The Remedy of Sleep, written by someone who clearly never experienced the condition. First suggestion involves drinking poppy juice and wine while facing east and thinking pure thoughts. Second requires tying lavender to your left foot, then hopping 3 times before lying down. The third suggestion, Brother Aldrich suspects this is an elaborate joke. It tells you to place iron under your pillow to draw out restless humours, then sleep in salt circles while reciting Christ's genealogy backwards. Brother Aldrich tried this once. He spent one night lying rigid in his salt circle, whispering backwards Latin, suave rebegeb sor, until his tongue cramped. His mind wandered into territories probably heretical. The salt attracted ants, every ant in the monastery, creating moving borders around his bed. He felt less like someone seeking divine intervention, more like someone being consumed by God's smaller creatures. You might think this sounds ridiculous, but you've never tried sleeping in a medieval monastery. The beds are constructed with engineering principles from someone who misunderstood furniture. The mattress, if you can call it that, consists of straw compressed into concrete, covered by sheets woven from disappointment. The pillow is grain in a small sack that doubles as percussion. Every head movement produces sounds ranging from gentle rustling to small avalanches. The bed frame is remarkable, created by carpenters who believe joints should be loose for creative movement. Every shift produces symphony, creaks and groans, slow structural failure of something never assembled properly. The supporting ropes have stretched. They sag like nets, creating sleeping surfaces like hammocks designed by someone who'd never seen water. Physical discomfort is just the beginning. Medieval buildings were designed by architects who believed privacy was character flaw. Sound insulation hadn't been invented. Walls have acoustic properties of paper. You can hear Brother Francis 2 rooms over having spiritual conversations with himself, which sounds suspiciously like detailed discussions about feeding chickens, followed by theological debates about cleaning sandals properly. Doors fit like medieval dentistry, which means they don't. The gaps around frames are wide enough for small animals. Every corridor footstep sounds like someone practicing professional ceiling walking. Door hinges were crafted from materials designed to announce every opening with town crier enthusiasm. Who discovered something scandalous? Windows present unique challenges. They're positioned with random precision, ensuring dawn wakes you regardless of direction, while providing excellent ventilation for ensuring you never get warm enough to sleep comfortably. Shutters, when they exist, fit like everything else in medieval architecture, creating gaps allowing light and air, but also rain, snow and insects, and occasional bats who mistake your chamber for convenient caves. The heating system operates on revolutionary principles of hoping God intervenes. There's a fireplace in the common room, but smoke travels in directions defying physics, usually ending up in your sleeping chamber, just as you're dozing. The chimney was built by masons who approached their craft like door makers. It draws smoke half the time. Other half it functions as reverse chimney, pulling cold air down and distributing it efficiently, like a system designed to prevent warmth. Brother Aldrich became an expert on medieval sleep remedies through desperate experimentation that left him understanding how many ways it's possible to be miserable while trying to rest. He consulted Brother Medicusus, the monastery's health expert, who has particular confidence that comes from never being successfully treated for anything. Wakeful melancholy, Brother Medicusus diagnosed, stroking his beard with satisfaction. The humours are imbalanced. Sanguine essence conflicts with choleric disposition, while phlegmatic temperament struggles against melancholic constitution. We must restore equilibrium through spiritual discipline and creative intervention. Creative intervention involved poultice made from crushed beetles, specifically dung beetles. Brother Medicus assured him they were particularly effective due to intimate relationship with Earth's natural cycles. This poultice was applied to the forehead while reciting apostles backwards, followed by Job recited in whispers, while standing on one foot. Brother Aldrich dutifully followed instructions, resulting in sleepless nights spent smelling like medieval garbage heap, while trying to remember was it Saduj or Sadej, whether Job's complaints were supposed to be comforting or a reminder that things could always be worse. Beetles left stains on his forehead lasting 3 days, attracting flies with enthusiasm of creatures discovering particularly appetizing delicacy. Next consultation yielded even more exotic suggestions. The remedy of St. Dunstan required sleeping with head pointing north while clutching blessed chalk, wearing nettle fibre shirts and keeping both feet in blessed water basins from 7 different priests. The theory Brother Medicus explained was that magnetic properties would align natural energies. Chalk would absorb negative influences, nettle shirts would stimulate skin promoting rest, holy water would cleanse feet of spiritual contamination preventing sleep. Brother Aldrich attempted this remedy with dedication of someone who'd run out of better ideas. He spent considerable effort locating 7 priests willing to bless water for foot-soaking purposes, which required extensive explanations about theological basis for aquatic spiritual cleansing. The nettle shirt was woven by Sister Agatha, who approached the task with clear enthusiasm for creating clothing designed to cause discomfort. Blessed chalk came from Brother Scribble, who carved it from limestone allegedly touched by saints' bones, whose name nobody remembered, but who was definitely associated with peaceful sleep and nocturnal difficulties. Chalk was blessed by the abbot himself, who performed ceremony with solemnity of someone taking enterprise more seriously than warranted. Actual implementation was masterpiece of medieval complexity. Brother Aldrich spent evening preparing his chamber, aligning bed with magnetic north, using borrowed compass from monastery's instruments, donated by sailor, who apparently concluded land navigation was preferable to oceanic adventures. Holy water basin was positioned carefully at bed's foot, filled to depth accommodating both feet without creating floods damaging ancient floors. Nettle shirt was donned with careful attention like putting on armor, which it resembled, except armor protected against external threats rather than creating constant irritated awareness. Blessed chalk was clutched in his right hand, like holding sacred relic, which it was. Except most relics weren't so likely to leave white marks on bedding. Entire arrangement was completed as monastery bells rang complean, creating sleeping environment, looking like organized ritual or confused magical experiment. Results were educational in ways medieval remedies usually were. Brother Aldrich learned it was possible to be simultaneously cold from the water, hot from nettle shirt, and uncomfortable from positioning required for proper alignment, while also unable to sleep due to combined effects of anxiety, physical discomfort and growing suspicion that entire enterprise was based on principles invented by someone who'd never tried resting. The cure of ancients involved special tea made from willow bark, dried mouse bones, and something called virgin's tears. Brother Medicus claimed to have obtained this from reliable sources but refused identification. Tea was brewed according to recipe seemingly designed by someone who confused cooking with alchemy, requiring precise measurements added in specific order, while reciting prayers supposed to enhance healing properties. Willow bark was harvested from monastery garden tree, stripped from eastern side during full moon by someone maintaining spiritual purity for 3 days prior. Brother Aldrich got this task, which required 3 days additional fasting and prayer, followed by midnight expedition to garden with blessed knife and collection bag made from linen woven by virgins. Mouse bones were challenging. Brother Medicusa specified they needed natural deaths, which required Brother Aldrich to develop comprehensive understanding of rodent mortality within monastery walls. After weeks of observation, he collected sufficient quantity of naturally deceased mice, then blessed by abbot and dried in herb garden under conditions seeming designed for dramatic effect rather than preservation. Virgin's tears remained mysterious. Brother Medicusux refused explanation, producing small vial of clear liquid. Could have been anything from blessed water to distilled wine. Brother Aldrich accepted it with faith of someone who'd already invested too much effort to question details. Brewing the tea was ceremonial precision. Recipe seemed designed by someone who'd never made tea while exhausted. Willow bark boiled exactly 17 minutes, then removed while reciting Paternoster 3 times. Mouse bones added during 18th minute, stirred counterclockwise with blessed wooden spoon carved from oak, then steeped while brewer contemplated temporary nature of earthly existence. Virgin's tears added last. Exactly 3 drops while facing east and thinking pure thoughts. Entire mixture strained through cloth, blessed by 2 different saints, cooled to room temperature, consumed while standing on 1 foot reciting Christ's genealogy in original Latin. Taste was indescribable. Assuming you wanted words that wouldn't be blasphemous. Brother Aldrich managed to consume entire cup through spiritual discipline and determination, from having spent weeks preparing something you wouldn't waste regardless of taste or digestive consequences. Effects were immediate and comprehensive. Brother Aldrich spent night alternating between nausea and floating detachment that might have been spiritual enlightenment, but felt more like early poisoning stages. He remained wide awake throughout the experience, but with distinct sense he was observing his own sleeplessness from considerable distance, as if consciousness had been separated from his body by cotton batting and mouse bones. Most memorable remedy was miraculous method of Saint Bede, which called for sleeping in different positions each night for full lunar cycle, while wearing hair shirts. Brother Medicus explained shirt needed weaving from horsehair that had been blessed by a bishop, died natural deaths and been mourned by 3 different people who'd never met. Finding such horse required extensive correspondence with other monasteries, travelling merchants and anyone else with access to equine hair with proper spiritual credentials. After several months searching, Brother Aldrich located monastery in the north, claiming to have horse meeting all requirements, having been blessed by bishop turned saint, died peacefully sleeping and been mourned by blacksmith, merchant and child who'd formed emotional attachment despite never seeing it. Hair was obtained through transaction involving considerable donation to Northern Monastery, along with written guarantee that horse indeed met all specified requirements. Actual shirt weaving was accomplished by Sister Agatha, who approached the task with enthusiasm of someone clearly enjoying creating another garment designed for discomfort. Completed shirt was masterpiece of medieval textile engineering, coarse and scratchy. Possessed of smell suggesting horse lived in less than ideal conditions prior to blessed demise. Garment was designed for wearing directly against skin. Brother Aldrich discovered this combined worst aspects of wearing thorn armor with spiritual discipline of voluntary suffering. Saint Bede's positional requirements were even more challenging. Each night required different sleeping position, chosen according to complex system, seemingly designed by someone who'd never tried sleeping. First night required left side sleeping, with right arm extended, left leg bent at precise angle. Second night called for back sleeping, with both arms crossed over chest, both feet pointing toward Jerusalem. Third night demanded right side sleeping, with left arm tucked under body, right leg extended. Fourth night required stomach sleeping, with both arms stretched above head, both feet crossed at ankles. Each position was specified with precision of someone measuring bodies for architectural projects. Brother Aldrich made it through exactly 3 nights before deciding insomnia was preferable to whatever combination of discomfort and discipline Saint Bede considered therapeutic. Horsehair shirt left him with rash lasting 2 weeks, and profound appreciation for regular wool comfort. even when regular wool felt like woven disappointment. Monastery library contained several other treatises on sleep, written by scholars who approached subjects with systematic thoroughness of people who'd clearly never experienced it personally. There was De Somno by Master Albertus, who concluded sleeplessness was caused by excess caloric vapors, cured by consuming large quantities of cabbage soup while standing on one foot during full moon. Soup needed preparation with specific vegetables grown in soil blessed by 3 saints, seasoned with salt blessed by bishops, consumed while reciting prayers supposed to calm choleric temperament. Brother Aldrich attempted this during appropriate lunar phase, spending evening consuming soup that tasted like penance design while balancing on one foot, and reciting prayers supposed to promote tranquility. Cabbage was grown in monastery garden using soil blessed by Saints Francis, Benedict and Agatha, creating spiritually enhanced growing medium that produced vegetables with taste and texture of holy suffering. Salt was obtained from coastal sources through complex trading involving 3 monasteries and merchants specializing in blessed condiments. Actual blessing performed by Bishop Gregorius, who approached the task with solemnity of someone taking spiritual seasoning enhancement more seriously than warranted. Consuming soup while balancing was exercise in medieval multitasking, testing both balance and ability to recite prayers while concentrating on not falling over. Prayers were selected for calming properties, consisting mainly of psalms dealing with peace, tranquility and resolution of earthly troubles, recited in voices supposed to be soothing, but mainly sounding like someone trying to pray while engaged in complex balancing acts. Results were predictable. Brother Aldrich spent night wide awake and nauseated from cabbage soup, possessed of leg cramp lasting until dawn. He also developed profound appreciation for difficulty of consuming liquids while maintaining single-foot stance, and learned it was possible to recite prayers while experiencing digestive distress, though combination raised questions about spiritual implications of bodily functions better left unexplored. Another scholarly treatise blamed sanguine imbalances, recommended bleeding because apparently solution to not resting was losing more blood and becoming more exhausted. Treatment was administered by Brother Phlebotomus, monastery's bloodletting expert who approached tasks with enthusiasm of someone who'd found true calling in controlled removal of bodily fluids. Theory, as explained, was that sleeplessness was caused by excess blood creating pressure within body, preventing natural relaxation necessary for rest. By removing precise amounts determined through complex calculations involving patient's age, weight, astrological sign and moon phases, internal pressure would reduce, allowing body to settle into peaceful slumber. Actual bloodletting performed using specially trained leeches fed on diets of blessed bread and holy water to enhance therapeutic properties. Leeches were applied to specific points corresponding to major humoral centers, where they performed work with dedication of creatures who'd found calling in medical arts. Brother Aldrich spent session lying perfectly still while leeches completed therapeutic feeding, experiencing peculiar sensation of being slowly drained by creatures who seemed enjoying their work more than he was. Process was accompanied by prayers and incantations designed to enhance healing effects, creating atmosphere combining medical procedure with religious ceremony in ways both impressive and deeply unsettling. Results were immediate and educational. Brother Aldrich felt profoundly tired, but in ways that seemed to prevent rather than promote sleep. He spent night lying in bed feeling too weak to move but too anxious to rest, while contemplating possibility that leeches removed not just blood but whatever substances were responsible for making sleep possible. You begin understanding why medieval people often look tired in their portraits. Sleep remedies fell into distinct categories, none seeming tested by anyone actually suffering from insomnia. There were herbal solutions involving consuming substances tasting like they'd been specifically designed to keep you awake, physical remedies requiring contorting bodies into positions seeming more likely to cause injury than rest, spiritual approaches assuming sleeplessness was moral failing corrected through sufficient discomfort, and folk cures passed down through generations who'd apparently solved sleep problems by becoming too exhausted to care whether they slept. More Brother Aldrich investigated, more he realized medieval medicine operated on fascinating principle. If treatment didn't work, clearly patient wasn't trying hard enough. Solution was always more treatment, more discomfort, more complexity, More blessed beetles and horsehair shirts and salt circles, as if sleeping was achievement requiring proper dedication rather than natural bodily function that should happen automatically. Village blacksmith named Godwin approached problems with straightforward logic of someone who spent days hitting things with hammers, had his own theory about insomnia. In his view, sleeplessness was caused by having too much energy, which could be solved by using up excess through vigorous activity before bed. Logic was appealingly simple. Tired people sleep, therefore making yourself tired would make you sleep. His prescribed treatment involved chopping wood until exhaustion, followed by sprint around the village, followed by exercises seeming designed to replicate experience of being attacked by invisible bears. Wood chopping was done with axes blessed by local priests using logs cut from trees grown in consecrated ground. Sprint around village was completed in specific patterns forming crosses when viewed from above, with stops at 4 cardinal directions for brief prayers. Brother Aldrich attempted this approach with enthusiasm of someone who'd tried everything else. Spent evening chopping blessed wood until arms felt like overcooked vegetables. Then ran around village in cross pattern while trying to remember appropriate prayers for each cardinal direction. Finished with bear attack exercises that left him convinced medieval fitness involved preparing for apocalypse. Results were educational in different way. Brother Aldrich discovered it was possible to be simultaneously exhausted and wide awake. Physical fatigue didn't automatically translate into sleepiness. Instead, he spent night lying perfectly still but feeling like his body was vibrating at frequency visible only to bats, while his mind raced through detailed analysis of everything that hurt, which was everything. After months of experimentation, Brother Aldrich reached profound conclusion. Medieval sleep remedies shared common characteristic. They were all designed by people who slept perfectly well, who approached insomnia like theoretical problem requiring complex solutions rather than practical difficulty needing simple rest, like asking someone who'd never been hungry to design elaborate feast cures for starvation. Real solution, when it finally came, was disappointingly simple. Brother Aldrich discovered monastery had spare chamber in tower section, unused because previous occupant had been Brother Methodius, who'd been transferred after developing tendency to practice mystical dancing at inappropriate hours. Chamber was smaller than his regular cell, but walls were thicker. Windows faced north, and most importantly, it was far enough from other monks that their spiritual conversations couldn't be heard. Moving required permission from Father Abbot, who initially resisted because sleeping in tower chambers was privilege reserved for senior monks who demonstrated exceptional spiritual development. Brother Aldrich diplomatically explained his insomnia experiments had been form of spiritual discipline, leading to profound appreciation for divine gift of peaceful rest. Plus he volunteered to maintain tower bells, which nobody else wanted to do because climbing spiral stairs multiple times daily was excellent penance. First night in tower chamber, Brother Aldrich experienced something he'd almost forgotten. Quiet. Real quiet. Not monastery quiet, which included distant prayers, snoring monks, settling buildings and nocturnal wildlife. Actual quiet, where loudest sound was his own breathing. He lay on same uncomfortable straw mattress, under same scratchy blankets, but without constant audio commentary from surrounding monastery life. He slept, not immediately, not perfectly, but he slept, for first time in months. When he woke the next morning, Brother Aldrich experienced revelation more profound than any achieved through blessed beetles or horsehair shirts. Sometimes solution to complex problem wasn't more complexity. Sometimes it was just different location with thicker walls. Brother Aldrich kept detailed records of his insomnia experiments, partly from scholarly interest, partly as warning to future monks who might be tempted to try remedies involving virgins' tears and backward genealogies. His manuscript became monastery's unofficial guide to sleep problems, titled What Not to Do When You Can't Sleep, a practical guide to medieval remedies that don't work. The manuscript included helpful sections like Why Blessed Beetles Make Poor Cosmetics, and Nettle Shirts, Fashion Statement or Medieval Torture, along with detailed cost analysis proving that moving to different room was significantly less expensive than obtaining rhinoceros horn. Even when room required daily stair climbing and bell maintenance, Most important discovery was that medieval people suffered from same basic problems as everyone else. They just had more creative ways of making things worse. Insomnia wasn't spiritual failing or humoral imbalance. Sometimes it was just noisy neighbors and uncomfortable beds. Sometimes simple solutions worked better than complex ones. Sometimes the best remedy was admitting previous remedies were ridiculous. Brother Aldrich's story spread through monastery network, becoming cautionary tale about difference between scholarly medicine and practical problem solving. Several other monasteries reported mysterious improvements in sleep problems after reviewing their chamber assignments and noise levels, though none officially acknowledged connection to Brother Aldrich's discoveries. Years later, Brother Aldrich became monastery's unofficial sleep consultant, helping other monks who developed nocturnal difficulties. His approach was refreshingly simple. First, try different sleeping location. If that didn't work, examine physical comfort issues. Only if basic solutions failed should anyone consider treatments involving blessed animal parts or elaborate positional requirements. His practical approach to sleep problems eventually influenced monastery's general medical philosophy. Brother Medicasus grudgingly admitted that sometimes simpler treatments worked better than complex ones, though he continued maintaining extensive collection of blessed beetles, just in case anyone needed poultices for spiritual emergencies. And Brother Aldrich? He slept peacefully in his tower chamber for rest of his monastic career, lulled by gentle sounds of wind and distant bells, far from theological debates about proper sandal cleaning and mystical discussions about feeding chickens. Proof that sometimes best cure for medieval insomnia was simply getting away from other medieval people. Invisible bear exercises were more complex, involving series of movements supposed to simulate combat with large aggressive animals. Brother Aldrich was to throw punches, kicks, and wrestling moves at empty air while imagining defending himself against creatures both invisible and apparently athletic. Entire sequence performed with enthusiasm of someone actually fighting for life until complete exhaustion was achieved. Brother Aldrich gamely attempted this regimen, resulting in night spent lying awake, while every muscle cramped simultaneously. Wood chopping was vigorous, enough to attract several neighbors who came investigating. Enthusiastic axe work and stayed watching. Subsequent sprint around village, performed with dedication of someone taking enterprise very seriously. Invisible bear combat was most challenging part, requiring Brother Aldrich to engage in warfare with opponent existing only in imagination. He threw punches at empty air with conviction of someone genuinely concerned about invisible bear attacks, while neighbors watched from windows with fascination of people witnessing either profound spiritual experience or complete mental breakdown. Exhaustion that followed was comprehensive and genuine, leaving Brother Aldrich feeling like he'd actually fought a bear, won the battle, then run miles to escape bear's friends. He collapsed into bed with confident expectation that sleep would be immediate and profound, only to discover it was possible to be too tired to sleep, which seemed like cosmic joke that medieval life specialized in. He learned that physical exhaustion and mental relaxation were not the same thing, and it was possible to have body too tired to move and mind too active to rest. Combination created state of paralyzed wakefulness, somehow more frustrating than regular insomnia, because it came with added element of having worked hard to achieve result, actually worse than original problem. But perhaps most elaborate remedy came from travelling scholar who arrived claiming expertise in ancient art of humoral balancing through environmental manipulation. This scholar called himself Master Philosophicus and wore robes, suggesting either great learning or fundamental misunderstanding of how clothing worked. Had theory that insomnia was caused by atmospheric disturbances corrected through careful arrangement of sleeping environment. Master Philosophicus spent days examining Brother Aldrich's quarters with attention to detail of someone conducting scientific investigation or casing joint for future burglary. He measured room dimensions, tested air quality, analyzed light patterns, and consulted charts and diagrams, seeming drawn by someone who confused architecture with astrology. His diagnosis was comprehensive. Brother Aldrich's cell suffered from imbalance of elemental forces, creating atmospheric conditions hostile to peaceful rest. Room's orientation was slightly off from optimal alignment with Earth's magnetic fields. Window placement allowed negative spiritual influences to enter during certain moon phases. Stone walls retained too much cold energy during winter months, too much heat during summer months. Most critically, room lacked proper arrangement of objects necessary to create harmonious sleeping environment. Prescribed solution involved placing specific objects around bed in precise patterns, each object chosen for particular properties, positioned according to complex calculations involving moon phases, dominant winds, and Brother Aldrich's astrological chart. Calculations required Master Philosophicus to spend considerable time with astronomical instruments, charts, and what appeared to be specially designed dice, while muttering incantations, either highly advanced mathematical formulas or very creative profanity. Brother Aldrich's treatment required sleeping surrounded by 7 stones representing planetary influences, 3 pieces of different metals to balance elemental forces, bowl of water for emotional harmony, and small fire in metal brazier for spiritual purification. Each object positioned at specific distances from bed, aligned with compass directions, and blessed according to rituals seeming designed by someone who confused interior decorating with religious ceremony. 7 stones were selected, with care typically reserved for choosing gemstones for royal crowns. Each stone represented different planet and possessed specific properties, contributing to overall harmony of sleeping environment. Master Philosophicus spent time examining monastery's rock collection, testing each one for astrological properties, using methods involving holding stones up to various light sources while humming what he claimed were ancient harmonizing chants. Final selection included granite piece for Saturn to promote discipline and structure, marble chunk for Jupiter to encourage wisdom and peace, slate fragment for Mars to control aggressive impulses, sandstone piece for Sun to provide warmth and vitality, limestone shard for Venus to promote harmony and love, flint piece for Mercury to encourage clear thinking, and smooth riverstone for Moon to regulate sleep cycles and dream. Each stone was positioned according to calculations, seeming to require advanced knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and possibly divination. Granite was placed at bed's foot, precisely aligned with magnetic north. Marble was positioned at bed's head, angled to catch first dawn rays. Slate was placed to bed's left, at distance measured using string cut to specific length based on Brother Aldrich's height and current moon phase. 3 metal pieces were even more complex to arrange. Master Philosophicus specified they needed to be iron for strength and protection, copper for healing and harmony, and silver for purification and spiritual clarity. Iron was obtained from monastery's blacksmith, who provided metal blessed by 3 saints and never used for violent purposes. Copper was challenging, requiring correspondence with merchants specializing in metals mined under specific astrological conditions. Final piece came from mine operating only during certain moon phases, using tools blessed by priests specializing in spiritual aspects of metallurgy. Silver was most expensive, requiring Brother Aldrich to invest significant portion of personal allowance in metal certified as having been mined by monks maintaining spiritual purity throughout extraction process. Silver was shaped into small disc, engraved with symbols Master Philosophicus claimed were ancient protective runes, but looked suspiciously like someone practicing creative penmanship. Bowl of water was filled with liquid, collected from 7 different sources, each chosen for particular spiritual properties. Collection process required Brother Aldrich to travel to springs, wells, and streams scattered throughout the region, often at considerable distances from monastery. Each source approached with appropriate reverence. Water collected using vessel blessed for purpose. 7 sources included spring dedicated to Saint Brigid for healing and purification, well associated with Saint Patrick for protection and wisdom, stream flowing past shrine to Saint Francis for peace and harmony with nature, pond located near chapel dedicated to Saint Mary for compassion and maternal protection, river blessed by Saint Benedict for discipline and spiritual strength, fountain maintained by nuns specializing in healing for physical restoration, and rainwater collected during thunderstorm on Saint Michael's feast day for protection against evil influences. Collection from each source was accompanied by specific prayers and rituals supposed to enhance spiritual properties. Brother Aldrich spent weeks traveling from location to location, often in weather, determined to demonstrate that collecting blessed water was not intended to be comfortable process. Small fire in metal brazier was most complex component. Master Philosophicus specified fire needed lighting, using methods ensuring spiritual purity, maintained using fuel selected for properties. Brazier was obtained from craftsmen specializing in religious metalwork, created using techniques passed down through generations of artisans who approached craft as spiritual discipline. Fire lit using flint and steel, blessed by bishops with tinder made from materials collected from sacred locations. Initial flame created during specific moon phase, while lighter maintained spiritual purity and recited prayers supposed to sanctify fire-making process. Fuel for maintaining fire was selected with care, typically reserved for choosing ingredients. For sacramental wine, Master Philosophicus specified fire needed feeding with wood from trees grown in consecrated ground, herbs dried using methods preserving spiritual properties, and oils extracted from plants blessed by saints specializing in spiritual aspects of combustion. Result was sleeping chamber, looking like either pagan ritual site or very confused armory, and smelling like combination of wet metal, burning herbs, and concentrated essence of religious enthusiasm. Brother Aldrich spent night alternately worrying he was committing heresy and trying not to set himself on fire, while brazier filled cell with smoke seeming designed more for drama than practical purposes. Stones created obstacle course, making midnight navigation extremely hazardous, particularly when Brother Aldrich needed getting up for various purposes that couldn't be postponed until dawn. Metals reflected firelight in ways creating shifting wall patterns, making room look like it was inhabited by creatures existing only in shadows. bowl of blessed water attracted insects, seeming to view sanctified liquids as particularly appetizing buffet. Overall effect was impressive, in ways medieval remedies often were: comprehensive, expensive, spiritually significant, and completely ineffective. At promoting sleep, Brother Aldrich spent night wide awake, surrounded by blessed objects, watching fire create dancing shadows while contemplating possibility. Master Philosophicus was less interested curing insomnia than conducting elaborate experiment in medieval decorating. You might wonder how medieval people managed to reproduce at all, given half the population seems permanently exhausted by sleeping arrangements, but apparently other half was kept awake by different problems: crying babies, snoring spouses, and general pandemonium of medieval domestic life, operating on principle that privacy was luxury that hadn't been invented. Situation was complicated by medieval architecture, seeming designed by people who'd never lived in buildings. Medieval houses were constructed using engineering principles of people who'd confused shelter with structured outdoor camping. Walls were thick enough to stop arrows, but thin enough that you could hear neighbors' digestive processes in embarrassing detail. Windows were positioned with random precision, ensuring dawn would wake you, regardless of direction, while providing ventilation for ensuring you never got warm enough to sleep comfortably. Doors had been designed by carpenters who believed precise fit was showing off that violated medieval principle of making everything harder than necessary. Gaps around frames were wide enough for small animals, meaning conversations in adjacent rooms were conducted with acoustic properties of public announcements. Medieval urban planning contributed to sleep problems through simple expedient of placing incompatible activities in close proximity. Blacksmiths worked next to bakeries, operating next to taverns, located across from churches, creating neighborhoods combining sounds of hammering, baking, drinking, and praying in symphony, continuing throughout night with enthusiasm of people who'd never heard of noise ordinances. Beds themselves were marvels of engineering, if by marvels you mean examples of how many ways possible to misunderstand basic furniture concepts. Wealthy slept on frames, creaking like ship rigging in storms, while poor made do with arrangements essentially controlled falling. Everyone's mattress was stuffed with materials seeming chosen for ability to create discomfort, straw poking through whatever covering had been optimistically placed over it, feathers retaining smell of original owners, and organic materials seeming to slowly decompose while being slept on. Brother Aldrich became something of connoisseur of medieval bedding through research into sleep remedies. He learned there were subtle but important differences between straw merely uncomfortable and straw actively hostile. He discovered grain type used for stuffing affected not only mattress firmness but also variety of insects, making homes in it, creating sleeping environment, both uncomfortable and actively populated with creatures who had schedules and activity. He developed ability to identify mold types by smell, which was useful, since most monastery bedding seemed to cultivate several varieties simultaneously. Mold contributed to overall sleeping experience by creating atmosphere, both musty and slightly threatening, as if bed itself was slowly transforming into something belonging in swamp rather than sleeping chamber. Sheets were made from materials suggesting medieval textile workers were in competition to see who could create most uncomfortable sleeping surfaces. Wool sheets feeling like sleeping wrapped in sheep that died of anxiety. Linen sheets achieving texture somewhere between canvas and tree bark. And in most luxurious accommodations, silk sheets apparently designed to ensure sleeper would spend night sliding gradually toward floor, creating sleeping experience, combining discomfort with constant threat of falling, but even solving physical discomfort problems. There remained issue of medieval nightlife, which was considerably more active than expected. Cities and towns operated under assumption that sleep was private matter that shouldn't interfere with public activities, continuing throughout night with enthusiasm of people who'd never heard of concept that some activities might be more appropriate during daylight. Night watchmen walked streets, calling out hours, in voices carrying for miles, apparently on theory that everyone needed knowing. It was still night time, and they still weren't sleeping. Calls were made with dedication of people specifically trained to project voices as far as possible, often including additional information about weather conditions, security updates, and observations about world state seeming designed more for entertainment than practical purposes. Church bells rang regularly throughout nights, marking not only hours, but also religious observances, requiring participation of anyone within 5 miles, willing or not. Bell ringers approached tasks with enthusiasm of people entrusted with sacred duties, requiring them to make as much noise as possible, often engaging in elaborate sequences, seeming designed to demonstrate technical skill rather than provide simple timekeeping services. Craftsmen working with materials best processed in cool conditions often operated throughout nights, resulting in neighborhoods echoing with sounds of hammering, sawing, and what appeared to be competitive cursing. Night shift workers seemed to operate under assumption that darkness provided acoustic insulation, leading to conversations and work activities conducted at volumes considered excessive during daylight. Animals, both domestic and otherwise, maintained their own schedules, seeming designed to maximize inconvenience for anyone trying to sleep. Dogs barked at everything and nothing, with dedication of creatures specifically trained to identify exact moments when owners were falling asleep. Barking was often conducted in collaboration with other dogs, creating elaborate vocal performances, seeming to involve complex harmonies and call and response patterns, continuing until dawn, or until someone threw something heavy enough to discourage further musical collaboration. Cats engaged in elaborate territorial disputes, sounding like small wars, complete with strategic planning, surprise attacks, and victory celebrations, seeming designed to wake everyone in vicinity. Feline warfare was conducted with intensity of creatures who took property rights very seriously and were prepared to defend territory through methods involving considerable vocal expression and athletic ability. Horses contributed to nighttime symphony through various forms of equine commentary, seeming to involve opinions about their accommodations, their food, their neighbors, and general world state. Horses' observations were expressed through combination of neighing, snorting, and hoof stamping, creating percussive accompaniment to other animal activities, pigs, chickens, and various livestock. Added voices to nocturnal chorus, creating soundscape that would have been impressive if anyone wanted hearing it. Livestock seemed operating under assumption that nighttime was appropriate for social activities. Territorial disputes and various animal communication requiring considerable volume and persistence. Brother Aldrich tried various approaches to dealing with noise. He stuffed ears with wool, which muffled sounds enough that he could hear his heartbeat with unusual clarity, creating rhythmic thumping, somehow more distracting than original noise. Heartbeat seemed unusually loud and irregular, leading to concerns about cardiovascular health, probably not conducive to peaceful rest. He tried covering head with his pillow, which resulted in choice between suffocation and auditory assault. Pillow being filled with grain provided approximately as much sound insulation as thin canvas layer, while also creating breathing environment, suggesting he was slowly being buried alive under pile of agricultural products. He even attempted method of selective attention recommended by Master Philosophicus, which involved consciously listening to each sound, then mentally dismissing it as unimportant. Technique had unexpected result of making him hyper-aware of every noise in monastery until he could identify individual monks by breathing patterns, and had developed detailed theories about personal lives of various rodents living in the wall. Selective attention method also led to discovery that monastery contained far more noise sources than previously realized. There were creaking timbers, seeming engaged in slow-motion structural conversations, settling stones, making occasional comments about weight they supported, and various pipes and conduits carrying water, air, and mysterious substances while producing sounds, suggesting they weren't entirely comfortable with architectural duties. Seasonal variations in medieval sleep problems added another layer of complexity to already challenging situations. Summer brought heat, turning sleeping chambers into ovens, along with insects, seeming to view human blood as seasonal delicacy available in convenient immobile packages. Preferred cooling method involved opening windows, which invited not only fresh air but also bats, night birds, and concentrated essence of whatever was decomposing in streets below. Summer insects were particularly creative in approaches to human interaction. Mosquitoes operated with precision of tiny aerial surgeons, identifying exposed skin with accuracy of creatures specifically designed for preventing sleep. Flies seemed to view sleeping humans as landing platforms for extended rest stops, often settling on faces, hands, and other exposed areas, with dedication of creatures taught that stillness was invitation to extended visitation. Winter brought cold that no amount of blankets seemed capable of addressing, along with snow that tended to blow through window shutters, fitting about as well as everything else in medieval buildings. Heating solutions involved fires filling rooms with smoke, braziers creating both warmth and constant risk of accidental incineration, and shared body heat, raising questions about personal space and hygiene better left unexplored. Winter cold seemed to have intelligence, finding gaps in clothing and bedding with precision of something specifically trained to locate and exploit weaknesses in human thermal defense. Cold would settle into sleeping chambers like unwelcome guest who decided to make extended visits, creating environment where sleeping required strategic positioning, multiple covering layers, and acceptance that warmth was theoretical concept rather than achievable goal. Spring and autumn offered their own challenges, mud somehow finding its way inside. Regardless of how carefully you sealed doors. Rain discovering previously unknown roof leaks. That seemed adequate during dry weather and winds rattling shutters with persistence of someone trying to break in, using atmospheric pressure as battering ram. Spring mud seemed specially formulated to adhere to everything touched, while possessing ability to track itself indoors through methods defying basic physics. Brother Aldrich spent time trying to understand how mud could appear on surfaces never in contact with outdoors, eventually concluding medieval mud possessed properties not entirely natural. Autumn winds were particularly impressive, creating constant background noise, suggesting monastery was under siege by atmospheric forces with personal grievances against anyone trying to sleep. Winds would howl through stonework gaps, whistle through improperly fitted windows, and rattle doors, with enthusiasm of something either trying to get in or trying to get out, but definitely trying to make as much noise as possible. Brother Aldrich experienced all these seasonal variations during ongoing battle with insomnia, and came to conclusion that medieval buildings were designed by people who fundamentally misunderstood shelter concepts. They kept out rain approximately half the time, blocked wind when coming from certain directions, and provided warmth through methods often more dangerous than effective. Roofs particularly seemed constructed using principle that water would probably find its way out, eventually, without much concern for where it might go. In meantime, Brother Aldrich learned to identify leak types by sound, steady drip, suggesting persistent but manageable problem, irregular plop, indicating structural issues probably getting worse, and sudden gush, meaning something failed completely, requiring immediate attention. But perhaps most challenging aspect of medieval sleep problems was medical advice available for addressing them. Field of sleep medicine in Middle Ages was dominated by theories seeming developed by people who'd never slept, based on principles appearing derived from rolling dice and consulting voices that probably should have been ignored. Theory of humoral imbalance suggested sleeplessness was caused by having too much of certain bodily fluids and not enough others, corrected through treatments seeming designed more to punish than heal. Diagnostic process involved examining various bodily emanations, comparing them to charts apparently created by people who'd never seen actual human bodies. If diagnosed with excess choleric humor, treatment involved consuming foods and medicines that were cool and moist, while avoiding anything warm or dry. This meant diet of boiled vegetables, cooked until achieving texture and nutritional value, of wet cardboard, weak ale watered down until barely distinguishable from regular water, except for faint fermentation suggestion, and substances tasting like they'd been specifically chosen for ability to discourage eating. Ideal was this, would cool fires of wakefulness, though in practice mainly resulted in different kind of discomfort, no more conducive to sleep than original problem. Brother Aldrich spent weeks on choleric humor diet, during which he learned it was possible to be simultaneously hungry and nauseated, while developing appreciation for foods that actually had flavor. Excess sanguine humor required treatments that were cold and dry, leading to recommendations for foods apparently selected by someone who'd never tasted them. Dried fish achieving leather texture and flavor of something left in sun too long. Bread made from grains seeming chosen for ability to resist human digestion, creating chewing experience more like trying to eat compressed sawdust, shaped into loaves. Wine watered down until barely distinguishable from regular water, except for faint Alcoholic suggestion mainly, serving to remind you of what you weren't drinking. Sanguine humor diet was particularly challenging because seemed designed to remove all pleasure from eating while also failing to provide adequate nutrition, creating state of chronic dissatisfaction, probably not conducive to peaceful rest. Melancholic humor and balance, often blamed for persistent sleeplessness, required warm and moist treatments sounding more appealing until you learned what they actually involved. Soups made from ingredients seeming selected by someone who confused cooking with alchemy, often featuring combinations of herbs, vegetables, and mysterious substances, creating flavors previously unknown to human experience. Herbal teas achieving new depths of bitterness while possessing aromatherapeutic properties, seeming designed to clear sinuses through simple expedient of making breathing temporarily undesirable. Poultice is supposed to be warming, but actually feeling like being attacked by hot, wet cloth, smelling of desperation and marinated in substances better left unidentified. And then there was phlegmatic humor, apparently requiring treatments that were warm and dry, resulting in recommendations including sleeping near fires, creating fire hazards, consuming spicy foods before bed, creating digestive disasters, and wearing extra clothing while sleeping, creating overheating and general misery. Phlegmatic treatments seemed designed by someone who approached sleeplessness by trying to create as many new problems as possible. Brother Aldrich dutifully tried treatments for each of four humors, often simultaneously, under theory that if one approach didn't work, maybe combining all would achieve something. Result was comprehensive tour of medieval discomfort that left him with profound appreciation for how many ways it was possible to be miserable while trying to sleep. Combination treatments were particularly educational, creating new forms of discomfort seeming to violate basic principles of human physiology. It was possible. He had learned to be simultaneously too hot and cold, overfed and undernourished, spiritually purified, physically contaminated. Medieval approach to medicine seemed to operate on principle that if you couldn't solve a problem, you could at least make it more interesting by adding complexity. As sleepless nights stretched into weeks, Brother Aldrich began developing his own theories about medieval insomnia based on radical notion that maybe problem wasn't spiritual or humoral or atmospheric, but simply that medieval life was not particularly conducive to rest. Theory was not well received by various experts he consulted, who seemed preferring explanations involving complex treatments and expensive remedies, but evidence was overwhelming. Medieval people lived in buildings designed more for defense than comfort, slept on beds seeming constructed by people who'd never tried sleeping, ate foods often more challenging than nourishing, and followed daily schedules appearing designed by someone who'd never experienced fatigue. They were surrounded by noise, cold, dampness, smoke, uncomfortable clothing, and medical advice, seeming developed by people who approached human health as intellectual exercise rather than practical concern. They lived with constant awareness that disease, violence, and divine judgment could strike any time, creating background anxiety that would make sleep difficult under best circumstances. Daily routine of medieval life seemed designed to prevent rest through simple expedient of never allowing enough time for it. Monastic schedule required attendance at religious services, spaced throughout day and night at intervals, seeming calculated to ensure no one ever got more than few hours of consecutive sleep. Bells announcing services were positioned to be audible from considerable distances, ensuring even people not required to attend would be aware of every scheduled spiritual activity. Work schedules were equally demanding, requiring physical labor, both exhausting and never-ending. There were fields to be tended, animals to care for, crafts to practice, and various maintenance requiring constant attention. Work was often conducted in conditions that were uncomfortable, dangerous, or both, creating daily routine that left most people too tired to sleep, but too uncomfortable to rest. And yet somehow, medieval civilization managed to function, produce art and literature, build cathedrals, and generally carry on business of human culture, despite fact that significant portion of population seems to have operated on chronic sleep deprivation. This suggested either human beings were capable of far more resilience than Brother Aldrich had previously imagined, or medieval people had lowered expectations of comfort to levels considered pathological by any reasonable standard. Art and literature of the period, when examined closely, seemed to support sleep deprivation theory. Medieval manuscripts were filled with images of people who looked exhausted, angels appearing to suffer from chronic fatigue, and saints seeming to have achieved spiritual status through the simple expedient of staying awake long enough to have religious visions, probably caused by sleep deprivation. Architecture was equally revealing. Medieval cathedrals were designed to inspire awe and spiritual contemplation, but also constructed using methods requiring workers to spend years laboring in conditions that made sleep a luxury rather than necessity. Results were impressive, but also suggested medieval people had approached beauty creation through methods prioritizing suffering over comfort. After months of experimenting with every available remedy, Brother Aldrich had reached kind of philosophical acceptance of his sleeplessness. He had learned to use wakeful hours productively, copying manuscripts by candlelight and developing detailed understanding of monastery acoustics, probably not useful for anything but, at least educational. Manuscript copying became form of meditation, allowing him to focus attention on something constructive while his body refused to cooperate with desire for rest. He discovered it was possible to function on very little sleep, provided you were willing to accept certain level of mental fuzziness and tendency to see things that probably weren't there. Hallucinations had been mild and generally benign. Occasional movement in peripheral vision, voices seeming to come from empty rooms, and shadows appearing to move independently of supposed source. He developed ability to nap while standing, which was useful during long religious services, and to sleep with eyes open, which impressed fellow monks and concerned superiors. Standing nap technique required considerable practice, involving development of micro-sleep, allowing brief rest without actually falling over. Open-eyed sleeping was more challenging, requiring him to maintain convincing appearance of wakefulness, while actually achieving brief periods of unconsciousness. Most importantly, he came to understand that medieval life operated on assumption that comfort was suspicious, sleep was optional, and primary purpose of existence was to demonstrate ability to endure whatever hardships God, nature, and human ingenuity could devise. In this context, insomnia wasn't really a medical problem to solve, but simply another aspect of medieval experience, like cold, hunger, disease, and general sense that life was something to be survived rather than enjoyed. medieval worldview seemed operating on principle. That suffering was educational, discomfort was character building, and anyone complaining about physical hardship was probably lacking in spiritual development. Sleep, like most physical pleasures, was viewed with suspicion by authorities, seeming to believe too much rest would lead to moral decay, spiritual weakness, and various corruptions, best prevented through simple expedient of making sleep as difficult as possible. This philosophy extended to every aspect of medieval life, from furniture design to daily scheduling. Chairs were constructed to discourage lounging, beds were designed to prevent excessive comfort, daily schedules arranged to ensure no one had too much time for rest or relaxation. Result was civilization that had elevated discomfort to art form, creating living conditions considered inhumane by modern standards, but accepted as normal by people who'd never known better. Brother Aldrich gradually came to understand that his insomnia was not departure from medieval normalcy, but rather perfect example of it in a world where comfort was considered morally suspect and hardship was viewed as spiritually beneficial. Chronic sleeplessness was not really a problem to solve, but simply another opportunity for personal growth through creative suffering. Realization had been both liberating and deeply depressing. On one hand, it meant he could stop feeling guilty about inability to sleep and start viewing condition as evidence of spiritual dedication. On the other hand, it suggested he was living in civilization that had fundamentally misunderstood relationship between physical well-being and human flourishing, creating culture that celebrated suffering for its own sake, rather than as means to particular end. Other monks, when he tentatively shared his theories with them, had responded with enthusiasm typically reserved for discussions of particularly interesting theological questions. Several had confessed they too suffered from various sleeplessness forms, but had been too embarrassed to seek help because they assumed inability to rest was evidence of spiritual inadequacy rather than environmental dysfunction. Brother Francis had revealed he'd been awake for most of the past 3 years, but had been pretending to sleep during rest periods because he was afraid admitting insomnia would result in additional spiritual discipline that would make the problem worse. He developed elaborate techniques for simulating sleep, including controlled breathing patterns and carefully timed movements, creating illusion of natural rest cycles. Brother Benedict confessed he'd been supplementing diet with various herbs and potions obtained from traveling merchants, most completely ineffective, but had provided psychological comfort of feeling like he was doing something about his condition. Herbs included substances that were probably not entirely legal, others definitely not safe, and several that turned out to be ordinary kitchen spices repackaged and sold as exotic sleep aids. Brother Thomas admitted he'd been sleeping in monastery library for past 6 months because books provided better insulation than regular bedding, and reading material helped distract him from inability to rest. He'd become expert on various theological texts, never intended to study, simply because they were available during long hours of wakeful contemplation. Collective confession revealed insomnia was not individual problem, but systemic condition affecting significant portion of monastery's population. Realization led to informal discussions about possible solutions, most involving wishful thinking about alternative living arrangements not available within constraints of medieval monastery life. Discussions also revealed creative ways people had learned coping with chronic sleep deprivation. Brother Aldrich discovered he was not alone in ability to nap while standing, sleep with eyes open, or function on what appeared to be no rest at all. Monastery contained significant population of people who'd learned to live in state of permanent semi-consciousness, maintaining appearance of normal functionality while operating on edge of exhaustion. Coping strategies included techniques for micro-sleeping during religious services, methods for appearing alert during conversations when consciousness was only intermittent, and various approaches to completing work assignments, despite mental fog making complex thinking nearly impossible. Monks had developed collective expertise, management of chronic fatigue, sharing techniques and strategies with dedication of people who'd found themselves in situation requiring creative adaptation. But perhaps most interesting discovery was that monasteries' most accomplished scholars, artists, and spiritual leaders were often people who slept the least. Brother Illuminatus, who created monasteries' most beautiful manuscripts, worked primarily during night hours when insomnia made sleep impossible. Brother Musicus, who composed monasteries' most complex choral arrangements, claimed his best work came during periods of sleep-deprived inspiration, producing creative insights impossible during normal consciousness. Father Prior, known throughout region for theological scholarship, had confided that he had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in over a decade, but had found long periods of wakeful contemplation allowed him to develop philosophical insights requiring sustained attention only possible when sleep was not option. Patterns suggested medieval culture had not merely adapted to chronic sleep deprivation, but actually found ways to use it as creative and spiritual resource. Inability to sleep had been transformed from medical problem into involuntary spiritual discipline, producing results impossible under more comfortable conditions. Brother Aldrich began experimenting with this approach, using sleepless hours for activities requiring sustained attention difficult to maintain during normal daily routines. He started project of copying and illuminating complete Bible, working by candlelight during hours when sleep refused to come. Work required concentration and attention to detail, seeming to benefit from heightened awareness that came with chronic fatigue. He also began composing what he privately called his Insomniac's Guide to Spiritual Development, collection of observations about relationship between physical discomfort and spiritual insight. Writing provided productive use for wakeful hours while creating record of his experiences that might be useful for other people. In similar circumstances, Guide had grown into comprehensive exploration of medieval sleep problems, including detailed descriptions of various remedies he'd tried, analysis of architectural and social factors contributing to insomnia, and philosophical reflections on role of suffering in spiritual development. Work had become accidental anthropological study of medieval life, documenting aspects of daily existence rarely discussed in official chronicles or religious texts. Writing the guide helped Brother Aldrich develop more systematic understanding of his own experiences, allowing him to see patterns and connections not apparent when simply trying to survive. Each sleepless night, he began appreciating ways insomnia had forced him to develop skills and insights unnecessary under more comfortable circumstances. Heightened awareness from chronic sleep deprivation made him more sensitive to subtle details of monastery life, patterns of sound and silence marking time's passage, changing light quality throughout day and night. Individual characteristics, fellow monks only apparent during quiet hours when normal social interactions were suspended. He learned to identify different weather types by sounds they created, interacting with monastery architecture to recognize emotional states of other people through subtle changes in breathing patterns and movement rhythms, and to navigate monastery corridors in complete darkness using spatial awareness developed through months of midnight wandering. Skills were not particularly useful in practical sense, but contributed to environmental intimacy impossible to develop under normal sleeping conditions. Brother Aldrich became expert on monastery's nocturnal ecology, familiar with habits of animal residents, patterns of structural sounds, and rhythms of human inhabitants in ways no one else could match. Expertise also extended to understanding monasteries' spiritual rhythms, subtle variations in atmosphere, marking different seasons, feast days and periods of religious observance. Long hours of wakeful attention made him sensitive to changes in community's collective mood, effects of weather on spiritual practices, and ways physical discomfort influenced religious experience. Brother Aldrich began suspecting his insomnia was not entirely accidental, but might represent involuntary vocation directing his attention toward aspects of monastic life normally overlooked. Sleeplessness had forced him to become observer rather than just participant, creating perspective both valuable and impossible to achieve through conventional means. Realization led to shift in attitude toward his condition, from viewing it as problem to solve, to accepting it as circumstance to understand and utilize. He stopped trying to cure insomnia and started trying to learn from it. Approaching sleeplessness as spiritual discipline had been imposed rather than chosen, but no less valuable for being involuntary. Acceptance had not eliminated physical discomfort or practical challenges of functioning without adequate sleep, but reduced anxiety and frustration that had been making condition worse. Brother Aldrich learned to work with sleeplessness rather than fighting against it, developing daily routines, accommodating irregular rest patterns while still meeting monastic obligations. He also began sharing insights with other monks suffering similar problems, offering practical advice about coping strategies while providing different perspective on meaning and value of sleep-related difficulties. Informal counseling became popular among monasteries' insomniacs, creating support network for people who'd previously suffered in isolation. Network developed its own culture and customs, including midnight meetings for prayer and discussion, collaborative projects taking advantage of shared wakeful hours, and mutual support systems, helping members cope with practical and emotional challenges of chronic sleep deprivation. Group became unofficial but important part of monastery's social structure, providing community and purpose for people marginalized by inability to conform to normal sleep pattern. But perhaps most importantly, Brother Aldrich came to understand that individual experience of insomnia was part of larger pattern characterizing medieval life more generally. Inability to sleep was not aberration, but natural consequence of living in world designed without consideration for human comfort or well-being. Medieval people lived with constant low-level stress, from uncertainty about food, security, health, and survival. They inhabited buildings that were cold, damp, noisy, and uncomfortable. They ate foods, often inadequate, unpalatable, or harmful. They followed daily schedules that were demanding, inflexible, and exhausting. They practiced religious disciplines, emphasizing suffering and self-denial over physical well-being. In this context, chronic sleep problems were not medical condition, but normal response to abnormal living conditions. Various remedies developed to address insomnia were not really designed to solve problems, but to provide illusion that something was being done about it, while maintaining basic lifestyle patterns, creating difficulties in first place. Medical theories, religious explanations, and folk remedies all served same function. They allowed people to believe their sleep problems were individual failings corrected through proper treatment, rather than systemic issues requiring fundamental changes in how society was organized. Brother Aldrich realized his months of experimenting with different cures had been valuable, not because any had actually worked, but because they'd taught him. Problem was not with him, but with circumstances in which he was trying to live. Remedies had failed because they attempted addressing symptoms while ignoring causes built into basic structure of medieval existence. Understanding had been both liberating and troubling. It meant he could stop blaming himself for inability to sleep, but also meant there was no realistic solution to his problem within constraints of current life. He could learn to cope with insomnia, but could not eliminate it without making changes not available to him. As medieval monk, realization led to philosophical resignation, both peaceful and melancholy. Brother Aldrich accepted he would probably never sleep well as long as he remained in monastery, but also learned to find value and meaning in sleeplessness that made condition bearable and even preferable to alternatives. He began thinking of himself as nocturnal guardian of monastery, someone whose wakeful attention helped maintain spiritual and physical security of community during hours when most people were unconscious and vulnerable. Role was entirely self-appointed and probably unnecessary, but provided sense of purpose, transforming insomnia from burden into form of service. Transformation had been gradual, but profound, changing not just attitude toward condition, but understanding of place in monastic community and relationship to larger patterns of medieval life. Brother Aldrich learned to see sleeplessness as window into aspects of existence normally hidden, perspective both painful and illuminating. And so Brother Aldrich continued his nights of wakeful contemplation, surrounded by collection of failed remedies and abandoned treatments, listening to familiar symphony of monastic snoring, rodent activity, and distant sounds of world that never quite settled into rest. He learned to find certain peace in sleeplessness, quiet acceptance that rest, like most good things in medieval life, was something that happened to other people in other times, in places where mattresses were soft and walls were thick, and primary concerns of daily life didn't include whether you'd survive until morning. It wasn't sleep he'd hoped for, but it was, in its own exhausted way, kind of medieval enlightenment, understanding that sometimes best you could do was stay awake with dignity, surrounded by remedies that didn't work, in world that never quite figured out difference between exist and living, but had at least perfected art of creative suffering. After all, in age where comfort was considered morally suspect, and hardship viewed as character building. Perhaps insomnia wasn't a problem to solve, but simply another opportunity to demonstrate that medieval people could find way to make anything more difficult than necessary. And some still call it progress. Sleep, much like sanity, wasn't really medieval priority. It was luxury, belonging to softer ages, when people had time to worry about things like rest and comfort, instead of focusing on more important business of enduring whatever ingenious forms of discomfort their civilization could devise. Brother Aldrich had learned to sleep finally, not in his bed, but in spaces between exhaustion and acceptance, in quiet moments, when impossibility of rest became kind of rest itself, and insomnia transformed from medical condition into peculiar form of medieval wisdom, knowledge that sometimes most restful thing you can do is stop trying to rest and find peace in recognition that wakefulness, like everything else in medieval life, was just another creative way to suffer gracefully while calling it spiritual development. The monastery bells rang lords again. Another sleepless night had passed. Brother Aldrich rose from his straw mattress, feeling neither rested nor particularly tired, but somehow at peace with the strange rhythm of his wakeful existence. Outside his window, dawn was breaking over a world that had somehow learned to function beautifully, despite getting very little sleep, and perhaps that was the most medieval miracle of all. 3 weeks after Brother Aldrich's final sleepless night, word reached the monastery about strange happenings. In the village below, people were talking about the baker's wife, who had developed an unusual condition. She couldn't stop baking at midnight. Good wife Margaret had always been a sensible woman, the kind who measured flour with mathematical precision and could judge oven temperature by holding her hand near the door. For exactly 3 seconds, her bread was famous throughout the valley, dense, reliable loaves that lasted a week without going stale, perfect for people who understood that food was fuel, not entertainment. But something had changed. 3 months ago, Margaret began waking at the stroke of midnight. Not gradually, mind you, not the slow drift from sleep to consciousness that normal people experience. She would snap awake as if someone had rung a bell inside her head, and then she would feel an overwhelming urge to bake bread. At first, her husband Thomas had been nearly confused, waking to find his wife already in the kitchen, kneading dough by candlelight. "Go back to sleep," she'd whisper. "Just felt like making tomorrow's bread early." Thomas, being a practical man who appreciated fresh bread and valued his sleep more than mysteries, had shrugged and returned to bed. But as the weeks passed, the midnight baking became more elaborate, more peculiar. Margaret wasn't just making regular bread anymore. She was creating loaves in shapes that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. Twisted spirals that rose impossibly high, braided creations that looked like Celtic knots, and round loaves with patterns that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The villagers had started talking, as villagers do, when something unusual disrupts their carefully ordered understanding of how the world should work. Some said Margaret had been touched by fairy folk. Others whispered about demonic influence. A few practical souls suggested she'd simply been sampling too much of the baker's ale before bedtime. But Brother Aldrich, when he heard the story, recognized something familiar in the description. The sudden awakening, the compulsive activity, the strange sense that normal rules no longer applied. He'd experienced something similar during his own sleepless months, except instead of baking, he'd felt compelled to copy manuscripts with unusual intensity. He decided to investigate, with the blessing of the monastery's abbot, who was always interested in phenomena that might require spiritual intervention, or at least theological documentation. Brother Aldrich packed his satchel with writing materials, a blessed candle, and a small vial of holy water, just in case. The baker's house sat on the village's main street, a substantial building with living quarters above, the bakery below. When Brother Aldrich arrived, just after midnight, he could see candlelight flickering in the windows and smell the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread mixed with something else, something harder to identify. Thomas answered the door, looking haggard and deeply confused. "Brother Aldrich," he whispered, "thank God you've come. She's been at it for 3 hours already. And the bread?" He gestured helplessly. "Well, you'd better see for yourself." The bakery was warm, almost stifling. Margaret stood at the large wooden table, her hands deep in dough that seemed to glow with its own light. Around her, cooling racks held dozens of loaves, in shapes Brother Aldrich had never seen before, some twisted like frozen flames, others braided into patterns that hurt to look at. "For too long, Margaret," Brother Aldrich said gently. She looked up, her eyes bright, with an intensity that was both peaceful and unsettling. "Brother," she smiled, "I've been expecting you. Would you like to see what I'm making tonight?" She gestured to the dough in her hands. As Brother Aldrich watched, she began shaping it into what appeared to be a perfect spiral. But as she worked, the dough seemed to move of its own accord, twisting and turning in ways that suggested it understood something about geometry that ordinary flour shouldn't know. "When did this start?" Brother Aldrich asked. Margaret continued kneading, her movements rhythmic and strangely hypnotic. "The night after the fever broke in the village. You remember the fever? The one that made people speak in tongues and see things that weren't there?" Brother Aldrich remembered. The fever had lasted 2 weeks, claiming several lives, before mysteriously disappearing. As suddenly as it had appeared, he'd heard rumors that it had been cured by the village wise woman, using methods that weren't entirely conventional. "I was one of the last to recover," Margaret continued. "And when I did, something had changed. I could see patterns in everything. The way grain falls from a sack, the arrangement of stones in the wall, the shape shadows make when candlelight hits the furniture. And I knew that these patterns needed to be captured in bread." She held up the loaf she'd been shaping in the candlelight. It looked like frozen music, as if someone had taken a melody and somehow translated it into flour and yeast. Brother Aldrich stared at it and felt something shift in his mind, a recognition that he couldn't quite put into words. "The bread," he said slowly. "Does it do anything besides look unusual?" Margaret smiled, a secretive expression that suggested she knew more than she was willing to explain. "Try a piece," she said, cutting a slice from a completed loaf. "But be prepared for things to look different for a while." Brother Aldrich hesitated. His experience with unusual medieval remedies had taught him to be cautious about consuming anything that couldn't be explained by conventional means. But his curiosity and his growing understanding that some mysteries required direct experience overcame his caution. The bread tasted like regular bread, but as he chewed, the world around him began to change. Subtly at first, then more dramatically, the candlelight seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The shadows on the walls began forming patterns that seemed almost like writing in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "You see it now," Margaret said, her voice coming from very far away, though she stood right beside him. "The patterns that connect everything, the hidden geometry that holds the world together. The fever didn't make me sick. It made me able to see what was always there." Brother Aldrich watched as the patterns on the walls began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing complexity. They seemed to be telling a story about the relationship between order and chaos, between the seen and the unseen, between what people thought they knew about the world and what actually held it together. "How long does this last?" he asked, his voice sounding strange in his ears. Margaret laughed, a sound like water running over stones. "Until dawn, then everything goes back to normal. Except for the bread. The bread remembers what it learned during the night." She gestured to the cooling racks. "Each loaf holds a different pattern, a different piece of the puzzle. People buy them without knowing what they're really purchasing. But somehow they always choose the right one, the one that shows them what they need to see." Brother Aldrich spent the next 3 hours watching Margaret work, and slowly understanding that what he was witnessing was not madness or demonic influence, but something far more unusual and potentially more significant. Margaret had somehow developed the ability to translate hidden patterns of reality into edible form. As dawn approached, the patterns began to fade. The world slowly returned to its normal appearance, but Brother Aldrich retained the memory of what he'd seen, and more importantly, an understanding that the village's recent fever had been more than just an illness. It had been a kind of transformation. "For those who survived it, you'll tell the abbot?" Margaret asked, as she began cleaning her workspace, her movements now ordinary and practical, as if the previous hours had been perfectly normal. Brother Aldrich nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain what he'd witnessed, in terms that wouldn't result in accusations of heresy. "Will you come back?" she asked, as he prepared to leave. Brother Aldrich looked at the cooling racks, full of bread that somehow contained pieces of hidden truth. "Yes," he said. "I think I need to understand this better before I report to anyone." He walked back to the monastery as the sun rose over the valley, carrying with him the knowledge that the world was far more complex and mysterious than even his months of sleepless contemplation had suggested, and that sometimes the most profound truths were hidden in the most ordinary things, like bread baked by candlelight in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. 2 days after Brother Aldrich's encounter with the midnight baker, another story reached the monastery, this one about Eleanor de Vere, daughter of the village's most successful merchant, who had developed an unusual hobby. She was collecting things that shouldn't exist. Eleanor had always been a curious child, the sort who asked too many questions and paid attention to details that adults preferred to ignore. When she was 7, she'd asked her father why merchant scales sometimes showed different weights for the same object, depending on who was doing the weighing. When she was 10, she'd wanted to know why some customers could find exactly what they needed in her father's shop, even when that item hadn't been there. The day before, her father, Edmund de Vere, had dismissed these questions as childhood whimsy. Edmund was a practical man who dealt in practical things, cloth from Flanders, spices from distant lands, tools forged by local craftsmen, items that could be touched, measured, bought and sold. He had no patience for mysteries that couldn't be resolved with a good ledger and careful accounting. But after the fever had swept through the village, Eleanor's curiosity had taken a decidedly unusual turn. She'd begun finding things that had no business existing, a compass that pointed to lost objects instead of magnetic north, a piece of cloth that showed different patterns depending on the time of day, a small mirror that sometimes reflected things that weren't actually there. At first, Edmund had attributed this to his daughter's active imagination, especially after she'd recovered from the fever that had nearly killed her. Children often went through phases of seeing things that weren't really there. Usually, they outgrew it once they learned to focus on more practical matters. But the objects Eleanor was collecting had a disturbing tendency to actually work. The compass that pointed to lost things had helped recover 3 missing sheep, a valuable ring, and a merchant's ledger that had disappeared from a locked chest. The piece of cloth had warned the baker about a fire in his oven by showing flames in its pattern 3 hours before the actual fire started. Most unsettling was the small mirror which Eleanor had found in the ruins of an old chapel outside the village. The mirror reflected normal scenes most of the time, but occasionally it showed events that were happening elsewhere, or sometimes events that hadn't happened yet, but usually did within a day or two. Edmund had tried to dismiss these as coincidences, but after the mirror had shown him a vision, bandits on the road to the next town. The same day, he'd planned to travel with a cart full of valuable goods. He'd decided to postpone the journey. Later that day, news arrived that a merchant caravan had been robbed on that exact road at exactly the time Edmund would have been travelling. Word of Eleanor's unusual collection had spread through the village with the speed that gossip typically achieved. In small communities, some people thought she was blessed with prophetic gifts. Others whispered about unnatural influences. A few practical souls suggested she was simply very good at observing details that other people missed. But Brother Aldrich, when he heard about Eleanor's collection, recognized a pattern that connected her to the midnight baker and possibly to his own experiences with heightened awareness. During his sleepless months, all 3 of them had developed abilities that seemed to reveal hidden aspects of reality. He decided to visit Eleanor's family to see these objects for himself and perhaps to understand what connected the various unusual occurrences in the village. Since the fever had passed through, Edmund received him with the mixture of respect and awareness that successful merchants reserved for clergy who might disapprove of their business practices. Brother Aldrich, Edmund said, leading him into the family's comfortable parlour. Eleanor will be pleased to show you her collection, though I warn you, some of the items are difficult to explain. In conventional terms, Eleanor appeared, a girl of perhaps 15 years, with the bright eyes and intense focus that Brother Aldrich had come to associate with people who'd been changed by the recent fever. She carried a wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Brother Aldrich, she said, with the confidence of someone who'd grown accustomed to adults finding her situation unusual. Father says you're interested in things that don't quite fit into normal categories. Would you like to see what I've found? She opened the box. Brother Aldrich peered inside and felt the same disorienting shift he'd experienced in the baker's shop. The objects in the box seemed ordinary enough at first glance, but as he looked more closely, he began to notice qualities that shouldn't have been possible. There was a stone that appeared to be perfectly ordinary granite, but which felt warm to the touch, even in the cold winter air, and seemed to grow slightly warmer when Eleanor held it while thinking about people she cared for. There was a piece of old parchment that showed different text depending on who was reading it and what they needed to know. Most remarkable was a small glass vial that contained what appeared to be water, but which Eleanor claimed could show the true nature of any liquid. It was mixed with watch, she said, taking the vial to the parlour table where her father had left a cup of wine. She added a single drop from the vial to the wine. Immediately, the liquid changed colour, shifting through shades of red that seemed to tell a story about the vineyard where the grapes had grown, the weather during the growing season, and even something about the mood of the vint who'd made the wine. It shows the history, Eleanor explained, not just of the liquid itself, but of everything that influenced it. The soil, the rain, the hands that touched the grapes, even the thoughts of the people who were involved in making it. Brother Aldrich stared at the swirling colours in the wine cup and realised that he was looking at something that revealed the interconnectedness of all things in ways that normal perception couldn't access. Where did you find these objects? He asked. Eleanor smiled, the secretive expression that seemed common among the fever's survivors. They find me, she said. I'll be walking through the village or exploring the ruins near the old chapel, and I'll see something that calls to me, something that wants to be understood and used properly. She gestured to the objects in the box. Each one teaches me something different about how the world really works beneath the surface that most people see. The fever didn't make me sick. It made me able to recognize things that were always there, but hidden. Brother Aldrich spent the afternoon with Eleanor, learning about each object in her collection, and gradually understanding that what he was seeing was evidence of a reality far more complex and layered than orthodox theology or conventional wisdom typically acknowledged. The compass that pointed to lost things didn't just locate missing objects. It revealed the connections between people and the things they valued, showing how emotional attachment created invisible threads that could be followed across considerable distances. The cloth that showed different patterns wasn't just predicting future events, it was displaying the probability patterns that surrounded current situations, revealing how present choices would influence future outcomes. The mirror that sometimes showed events happening elsewhere or in the future was actually revealing the way that all moments in time were connected, past, present, and future existing simultaneously in ways that linear thinking couldn't grasp. The fever, Eleanor said, as Brother Aldrich prepared to leave, changed something in the way some of us perceive reality. Not everyone who survived it developed these abilities, but those who did seemed to be able to see and interact with aspects of existence that were always there, but previously invisible. Brother Aldrich walked back to the monastery that evening, carrying with him the growing understanding that the recent fever had been more than a medical crisis. It had been a kind of initiation for some people into a deeper awareness of how the world actually functioned. He began to see connections between his own sleepless months, the baker's midnight visions, and Eleanor's collection of impossible objects. All three experiences pointed to the same fundamental truth, that reality was far more fluid and mysterious than most people were prepared to acknowledge, and he began to wonder if the monastery's traditional approaches to spiritual development might benefit from understanding these new forms of awareness that seemed to be emerging in the village. Perhaps there were ways to cultivate these abilities deliberately rather than waiting for crisis or illness to unlock them accidentally. As he approached the monastery gates, Brother Aldrich realized that his investigation into unusual occurrences in the village had become something more significant than simple curiosity. He was documenting evidence of a fundamental shift in human consciousness that might change everything people thought they knew about the nature of reality. The bells were ringing vespers as he entered the monastery. Another day ending in the eternal rhythm of monastic life. But Brother Aldrich now understood that beneath this familiar surface reality, deeper currents were stirring, forces that might transform not just individual perception, but the entire way human beings understood their place in the vast mystery of existence. He looked forward to writing his report for the abbot, though he suspected it would raise more questions than it answered, and might challenge some fundamental assumptions about the relationship between spiritual development, physical reality, and the hidden connections that bound all things together in ways that defied conventional understanding.